An ironic result of Stalin's purges was the emergence of a new generation of Soviet aircraft designers. These gifted men included Alexander Yakovlev, Pavel Sukhoi, and Mikhail Gurevich, who would build some of the world's most famous fighters, with Artyom Mikoyan, and Semyon Lavochkin developed outstanding radial engine aircraft. During the move behind the Urals, Soviet aircraft production fell by 30%. But within 3 months, aircraft were streaming down the assembly lines in greater quantity than before. These new factories were also out of range of Luftwaffe bombers. In late 1941, the first of a new generation of fighters appeared. They were modern, low-wing monoplanes with enclosed cockpits and retractable landing gear. The aircraft were an improvement, but still, they left much to be desired. The new planes could not match the performance of German fighters opposing them. As the fighting raged, Soviet forces captured an increasing amount of German equipment. When examples of the high-performance Focke-Wulf 190 fighter fell into Russian hands, its advanced radial engine technology was studied under the guidance of Semyon Lavochkin. The lessons learned were incorporated into the Lavochkin La-5, which developed into one of the best Soviet fighters of the war. Not only did the Russian Air Force have new aircraft, the service was drastically reorganized. Fighters, bombers, and ground attack planes comprised mobile air armies that operated together with Red Army forces. The Soviet plan was adopted just in time. Hitler's Army Group B was throwing its weight to an offensive aimed at the industrial city on the Volga River named Stalingrad. Inside the city, General A.A. Novikov put his reorganized air force to work against the Germans, who employed all available aircraft for the assault. Novikov stressed hit-and-run ambush tactics against the Luftwaffe, who flew thousands of sorties. Ironically, the attacks by Hitler's air force served as on-the-job training for Soviet pilots. As more fighters were delivered to the front, the more adept they became at countering German tactics. Novikov's strategy was beginning to work. More and more transport aircraft were needed to resupply Nazi forces trapped inside Stalingrad. As the Soviet air defense ring tightened, Ju-52s were forced to run the gauntlet. The Russians presumed from the start that the Germans would have to airlift supplies to their troops. The Air Force drew a series of concentric rings around the German forces on the map. These designated areas became aerial blockades of fighter planes and curtains of anti-aircraft fire. If the Luftwaffe had had enough transports, they might have been able to supply the beleaguered 6th Army force entombed inside the destroyed city. But the Germans didn't have all the planes they needed. They assembled a ragtag collection of planes that were forced to operate under increasing bad weather conditions. The Russian Air Force grew increasingly aggressive, harassing the long lines of transports despite their fighter protection. Soviet fighters attacked German airfields. Germany suffered a humiliating defeat when the decimated 6th Army was forced to surrender. Hitler realized he now held a wolf by the ears. He ordered his retreating forces to undertake one last offensive. The target was Kursk, where Soviet troops occupied a bulge in the German lines, 450 kilometers south of Moscow. The attack was delayed for bad weather, and then because Hitler wanted to wait for delivery of his new Panther tanks. Meanwhile, a spy tipped off the Russians. As a result, they were able to prepare a defense in depth. The Soviet Air Force had more than 2,900 planes, more than 1,000 fighters, and 940 Ilyushin Sturmovik tank busters. The Germans massed more than 2,000 aircraft for the offensive. Because of demands in other fronts, they could only muster 600 fighter planes. At first, the advantage went to the Luftwaffe pilots, but soon the lack of fighter aircraft began to tell. The German planes could not break through the screen of escorting Yak-9s and La-5s to stop the marauding Sturmovix. After a huge struggle, Hitler called off the offensive. The days of glory were over for Germany and just beginning for Russia. On the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe suffered, but in the West, it got a boost in the form of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the greatest fighter of the war. Its jet power would be the future of high-performance aircraft. During the final months of the war, advancing Soviet troops captured German jet technology, developed at enormous cost and resources. In 1945, Stalin ordered a crash program to build fighters using captured German turbojets, as there were no suitable Soviet jet engines. When the MiG I-300 fighter prototype flew for the first time in 1946, it was powered by a German BMW engine. The production version was called the MiG-9. 550 were built between 1946 and 1948. They were powerfully armed with one 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons. Already the Cold War was beginning. Known by the NATO codename Fargo, the MiG-9 was the first Soviet fighter equipped with an ejection seat. The MiG-9 was a great achievement for Artyom Mikoyan. He was awarded the Stalin Prize, but the stress of the project led to a heart attack. Mikoyan had competitors, and one of them was Alexander Yakovlev, the famous wartime fighter designer. Yakovlev decided that the new aircraft would use components of the Yak-9 piston engine fighter to the greatest possible extent. The engine was mounted underneath the fuselage, and the tail was strengthened to protect it from hot exhaust gases. When the Yak-17 appeared, it featured a tricycle landing gear with the nose wheel housed in a bulge under the forward fuselage. Stalin was pleased with the jet fighters, and this established Alexander Yakovlev as one of the leading post-war designers. Along with Mikoyan and Gurevich, he was now at the top of Soviet design pecking order. In 1946, Artyom Mikoyan got a big break in the Cold War race to develop the greatest jet fighter. Along with the engine designer Vladimir Klimov, he visited Rolls-Royce in England. There, he learned that the acquisition of a small number of Nien and Derwent jet engines by the Soviet Union was likely. Mikoyan and Klimov quickly returned home and reconfigured their airframe and power plant proposals to meet the Nien specifications. When the engines were shipped to Russia, they were copied, and soon Nien 2s and Derwent 5s were rolling down the assembly lines, now known as Soviet RD-45s and RD-500s. The new aircraft differed greatly from the MiG-9. It featured a tubular fuselage with the engine mounted inside. The jet engine exhaust nozzle was at the rear of the tube, so those gases didn't come into contact with the fuselage. The heavy-duty landing gear folded into the wing, and the aircraft's skin was constructed of aluminium. On the 30th of December 1948, Viktor Yuganov flew the first production MiG-15 aircraft. It had outstanding performance. Production began in several satellite countries. The new fighters were delivered to Soviet air defense forces in January 1949. Like most Soviet fighters, toughness was the major characteristic of the MiG-15. It could withstand rough treatment without breaking. Improvements and modifications were incorporated into the aircraft as they were manufactured, and there were wide variations in quality and performance. The MiG-15 could fly 290 kilometers without external tanks. While it was not normal practice, some MiG-5As were equipped with aerial refueling capability. They were fed by Tu-4 tankers, which were modified copies of the Boeing B-29. In June 1950, Communist North Korean forces attacked South Korea with great speed and violence. Lightly armed South Korean and US Army troops took the brunt of the lightning offensive. While US forces managed to hold a perimeter around the southern city of Busan, UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur made an amphibious assault on the port of Incheon in North Korea. United Nations ground forces headed north, pushing the stunned North Korean forces before them. Air power played a crucial part in the conflict. US B-29 strategic bombers pounded North Korean troops, railroads and factories. Communist leader Kim Sung pleaded with Stalin for help against the relentless air attacks. Stalin secretly sent a unit of MiG-15s commanded by the top-scoring Soviet ace of World War II, Ivan Kozydub. The MiGs were shipped to China, then based in Antung, near the border with North Korea. In October 1951, MiG-15s decimated a force of 8 B-29s. 3 of the huge bombers were shot down, and the rest were heavily damaged. The B-29s were restricted from daylight operations, while the call for help went out. The MiG-15s were by far the most capable fighters in the sky, but soon US F-86A Sabre fighter jets were deployed to counter the MiG threat. The F-86 proved a match for the MiGs and eventually achieved a 10-to-1 kill ratio by the end of the war. Its success over the MiG-15 is still a matter of debate, but Soviet pilots did score an impressive amount of victories in the skies over North Korea. Back at Sagi, the Soviet Union's leading aeronautical research center, aircraft development continued during the heady atmosphere of the 1950s. Researchers looked for ways to improve the MiG-15. They conducted wind tunnel tests to investigate swept angle designs and the use of wing fences to improve boundary layer performance. The result was a new aircraft delivered in October 1952. The MiG-17, like the MiG-15, appeared in many different versions. The radar-equipped MiG-17PF became the standard interceptor of the Soviet Air Force. The MiG-17 PFU became the first operational aircraft equipped with air-to-air beam-riding missiles. A radar aiming sight was installed on the top of the engine inlet. The race for a supersonic fighter led Mikoyan designers to increase the MiG-17's wing angle to 55-degree sweep. This allowed for a faster, more powerful aircraft known as the MiG-19. The new aircraft was outfitted with the RD-9B engine, which had 25% more thrust than its predecessor. In early 1954, a MiG-19 reached Mach 1.33, unofficially breaking the world's speed record. But it wasn't claimed, in the interests of secrecy. At the time, the Soviet Union stretched from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. There were not enough airfields to protect the vast country. A rocket-assisted version of the MiG-19, the SM-30, was developed as a quick reaction fighter. The Russian solution was a truck-launched aircraft that could be recovered anywhere. The MiG-19 was rugged enough to land in fields after completing its mission.